Professor Adam Benforado. I'm very excited to speak with you today about my new book, Unfair, The New Science of Criminal Injustice. So I'm an academic, and usually I write books that are difficult to read and no one ends up reading them. And this time I chose popular press, and I wrote a book that's designed to appeal to everyone from academics to policymakers to general citizens. And I want to tell you about this book in part because it's a reform motivated book. It's meant to change the system that we have. I've been a criminal law professor here at Drexel for the last 7 years, and I've been thinking about problems with our criminal justice system for a long time. And what this book is about is the hidden forces that shape the behavior of judges and jurors and really everyone in our criminal justice system. And in each chapter, I take up a different one of these characters, and I contrast the conventional stories we tell about how these people make decisions and where things can go wrong with what the latest evidence from psychology and neuroscience has to say. So in this talk, I just want to focus on a couple of those conventional stories, myths about our criminal justice system. And I think that will at least give you a taste of what my overall focus is in Unfair. So the first myth that I want us to discuss is this notion that essentially when an eyewitness comes forward and picks someone out of a lineup and says, "I'm certain that that's the perpetrator," we can feel really confident that we have the right guy. The second myth that I want us to think about is the notion that judicial bias is subject to introspection and control. Essentially, bias in our federal judiciary and our state judiciary. It's just a matter of choice. You either choose to be an activist judge or you choose to be an umpire. So let's turn to our first myth, which is about eyewitnesses. So I want to take us actually down the East Coast, down to Meriwether County, Georgia. It's 1979. There's just been a brutal rape of a woman. And a couple weeks later, she's brought in to do an identification down at the local jail. And what's really interesting when I was doing research for the book is I found the photograph from this original lineup. And so these are the men that the victim looks at. And she scrutinizes each one of them, and she says, "Yep, it's number 3, right there in the middle." So John Jerome White, standing with the white shirt, he ends up being in prison for something like 2 decades. And it's only 2 decades later that they actually have the technology to test the DNA from the rape kit. And what do they find? Well, John Jerome White was not the perpetrator. Now, this type of case is not all that unusual. I found many cases in which an eyewitness misidentified someone who was then wrongfully convicted and spent many years in prison. That's not the part that shocked me when I came across this video. What was shocking was the real perpetrator is in this lineup. He just happened to be pulled in. He was locked up on an unrelated crime in the jail. They needed a filler. They pulled him in. And what's really upsetting here is that means that the victim looked eye to eye with her attacker and chose the guy standing 2 men over from him. So the real perpetrator is in the striped shirt right there on the end. And he would go on to rape another woman while John Jerome White sat in a prison cell. And so what I think this example shows is that good people with every intention to get things right, every intention to do the right thing, every motivation to achieve justice, can get things terribly, terribly wrong. And what we know is that every year, tens of thousands of Americans end up being charged with crimes after being identified in lineups just like this. Now, what we also know is that in actual police lineups in the United States, eyewitnesses select an innocent person about 1 out of 3 times when they pick someone out of a lineup. And what is the end result? Well, we know that out of the first 250 DNA exonerations in the United States. 190 of them involved eyewitness misidentifications. So what's behind these problems? Well, first of all, our memories just don't work the way that we think they work. We tend to think about our memories as cameras. And in fact, it's better to think about our memories as these active, changeable collages, which we're constantly reformulating as we walk through the world. So there are many things that can negatively impact how well we record and code a memory, and then how well we later recall it. And remember, many of these things aren't actually within the control of the police. So, for example, it's much harder for us to do an identification when we're identifying someone of another race. It's also a lot harder for us to identify someone when we've seen them in low light as opposed to at midday. It actually can be much harder to identify someone if we encoded that memory while physically exerting ourselves. We know all of this stuff from laboratory experiments. Now, I think the bigger problem with eyewitness misidentifications has to do with factors within the control of the police. Now, research suggests that very subtle suggestions by the person administering a lineup, for example, can seriously distort outcomes. So we know that when a police officer simply says something like, well, ma'am, just take your time, don't rush with what you're doing, as the person is about to identify someone who is known to be an innocent filler. Those kind of subtle hints can actually have a big impact. Another problem, which was prevalent in many jurisdictions and continues to be a problem today, is using multiple identification procedures. So oftentimes the police will initially have an eyewitness identify someone based on a show-up. The guy that they think did it, they'll have him sit outside of the bank in handcuffs, and they'll drive the witness by and say, "Do you see the person who robbed the bank?" Then, a couple weeks later, they bring the person in to do an identification, just like this one, where they're looking at either a live lineup or a photographic array. And then they'll finally have an identification in court. The problem with all of this is that from the jury's perspective, they see 3 correct identifications, and they think, well, this must be the right person. But what we know from the laboratory is that that first identification with the show-up is highly suggestive. And that initial identification might corrupt the other ones, because it's quite possible that the witness is actually just remembering the person they saw sitting on the side of the road, not the person who actually robbed the bank. So this is one of the reasons that I think we really need to rethink how we handle eyewitnesses. In particular, I think we need to focus on treating eyewitnesses a lot more like we treat other types of trace evidence, and focus on the fact that when we treat a blood sample with extreme care, we need to do the same thing with eyewitnesses. We need to accept that eyewitness memory is just as malleable, just as susceptible to corruption as blood evidence. All right, now let's turn to our second myth. And that's the one related to judges. So as I mentioned, in the United States, we tend to think that there are 2 types of judges. There are activist judges who just decide to follow their own agendas and ideology, who decide that they want to be biased to advance their own agenda. And then there are these umpire judges who, by contrast, decide that they are going to be objective and just call balls and strikes. Now, what the latest evidence from psychology suggests is, in fact, all judges are biased. And they're biased in many ways that are beyond our conscious awareness or control. Some of those biases relate to implicit racial biases that end up resulting in African Americans receiving higher bails, longer sentences. But others of them are really quite unexpected. So one of my favorite studies in the book involved the question of what drives parole grants or denials. So these researchers looked at actual parole boards in Israel. And I'm a criminal law professor. What I would have told you would be determining whether someone was granted parole was how serious a crime they committed, and how they did in prison. Did they reform themselves or not? Now, what the researchers found were those weren't the things that were determining whether someone was granted parole. what mattered the most was simply the time of day when the person appeared before the panel making the determination. If he came first thing in the morning, that was a really great time. If he came right before the first break in the day, that was a terrible time. We're still trying to figure out what the mechanism here, but one theory is that it has to do with mental depletion. Over the course of the day, we become mentally depleted, and it's more likely in those scenarios that we stick with the default because it's cognitively easier. The default, when it comes to a parole board, is just leaving the person in prison to serve out the rest of their sentence. So, as an example of judicial bias and the unexpected nature of judicial bias, I actually want to talk about a Supreme Court case from a few years back. And this case involved a police chase outside of Atlanta. So Victor Harris goes by a speed trap at 73 miles an hour. It's a 55-mile-an-hour zone. And rather than slow down when the cruiser pulls up behind him, he hits the gas. So a few minutes later, another officer, Timothy Scott, joins the chase. And after 6 minutes, he gets permission to pit the vehicle, which means come up, hit the back bumper, and send it into a spin. And Officer Scott decides to pit the vehicle on a straightaway in which the road sort of has sharp ravines on both sides. So he comes up, hits the back of the speeding vehicle, and it spins out, flips over, and young 19-year-old Victor Harris is paralyzed from the neck down. So Harris sues Officer Scott under the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable seizures. In the same way, he argues that you can't shoot a shoplifter in the back as he runs away from a store. You can't use a potentially lethal pitting maneuver for someone who's just been speeding. Now, in the lower court, Harris wins on the grounds that Scott's actions were unreasonable. But in the Supreme Court, things go differently. What's interesting about this case is usually the Supreme Court's very deferential to the lower court's findings of fact. In this case, how serious a risk was posed by the chase and who was to blame. But something was different about this particular incident. That was, there was a videotape of all of the events. Now, Justice Scalia watched this videotape and he said at oral argument, well, this is the scariest video that I've ever seen since the French Connection. And in the majority opinion, the Supreme Court said that no reasonable juror, after watching this video, could possibly see or believe that anything but an extremely dangerous chase was taking place, and that Victor was to blame for his ultimate paralysis. Now, what's really fascinating is some law professors decided to check that out. Is it true that no reasonable juror could possibly see it differently than the Supreme Court majority? And what they found was that people's backgrounds and experiences altered their view of this seemingly objective set of facts. So young African-American women, liberals who were living in the Northeast, tended to be a lot more likely to side with Victor Harris's version of the events than white, older, more conservative men in Western states. So what does this suggest? Well, it suggests that the facts of a case are determined largely by who you choose to be jurors, as opposed to there being some objective set of facts out there in the world. Now, there's another reason that I think we need to be skeptical of the videotape in this particular case's ability to offer an objective take on reality. And that's something that psychologists who study this call perspective bias. So if you think about it, it looks to us, when we first watch this video, as you can on the internet, of Victor Harris's chase, you look at it and you think, well, I'm just watching events exactly as they happened. You don't notice that you're actually watching things from the perspective of the police. And it's interesting to think about, what if the videotape that we had in this particular set of events was actually taken from inside Victor Harris's car on a cell phone, looking back at the cars, the police cars chasing him? Would that have encouraged viewers and the Supreme Court to appreciate what it must be like to be a 19-year-old black guy who makes a very silly decision, which is to speed away when the police pull up behind you, what it must be like to be on a largely deserted road at night in a suburb outside of Atlanta, maybe that would help people appreciate what that experience is like and be more likely to see events through Victor's eyes. Now, in research on this topic, scientists have looked specifically at the context of interrogations. And what they did was they set a camera up behind the interrogator and they set a camera up behind the suspect. Now, this choice shouldn't matter at all. After all, it's filming the same set of events. But what they found was when the camera was behind the interrogator, people were a lot more likely to watch the interrogation and say, well, that suspect voluntarily confessed. No problems with that. That can come into court. But when they watched events through the perspective and through the eyes, essentially, of the suspect, suddenly they started to appreciate all of these coercive factors, and they were far more likely to say, no, that particular confession is involuntary. And this is one of the reasons that I think that we have to be very careful with how we treat cameras moving forward. There's been a big push after recent events to equip all police officers with body cameras, to put more cameras in squad cars. And I think we need to be really careful as we move forward about embracing cameras as a cure-all to our problems. I think they can be very effective, but we just have to be careful with how we use the footage later. Now, in each chapter, I offer specific solutions with respect to how we can resolve problems with police departments, prosecutors' offices, and prisons. But I also make a broader point about where we need to go in the criminal justice system. And I think this broader set of changes needs to focus on embracing evidence-based justice. So we've gone through similar revolutions in medicine and business for a very long time. In medicine, it was the case that decisions were based on gut instincts by the doctor and anecdote. And people in the medical community decided that was a really bad way to decide whether interventions were effective and medicines worked. And so they started to embrace the empirical evidence. We need to do a similar thing in law. We are too deferential to those who have come before us. And I think that that's really the key to moving forward effectively. So that's just a taste of my new book, Unfair, The New Science of Criminal Injustice. Thanks so much for